You can't buy a bucket from the Roman Automotive Group, but if you're looking for a great deal on a newer quality pre-owned vehicle, drive the lane and score one at one of their 6 locations, right there in Fort Wayne. You'll have Kia, Infiniti, Lexus, Nissan, Subaru, and my favorite, Toyota. There's something for everybody at every budget. The Roman Automotive Group believes in doing more for their employees and their families, more for the customers, friends, and neighbors, and the Roman Automotive Group believes in doing more for what makes Fort Wayne a greater community. If you check out one of the 6 locations in Fort Wayne, just tell them I sent you. You won't be disappointed. Shout out to the Roman Automotive Group. Thank you for sponsoring this podcast. Before we get into this episode, we got to give one big shout out to AJ's Beef and Burgers and Beer right there on campus. Make sure you go by, get you a burger, get you a beer, watch a game, hang out. Best burger spot on campus. Make sure you check them out if you're ever in town. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Boiler Over Rapheal Davis podcast. Today we have a special guest, a legendary guest, a Purdue legend, a basketball legend, someone that, whether it's Purdue or not, you know his name. Someone I'm very grateful that he took his time to spend with us today. Everybody welcome Coach Steve Lavin. How you doing, Coach?
Great, Ray. Looking forward to some basketball banter and talking about the Boilermakers, of course, as well.
Right, yeah, no doubt. And before we get into that, because I know a lot of fans like myself, we're curious to kind of the coach, the person before the coach, kind of where you come up. Kind of know you were born in San Francisco, you played for San Francisco. Kind of tell us about that, and kind of when did you put the ball in your hands?
Yeah, so grew up in Northern California, and I was the youngest of 6 children, and fortunate to have parents who were outstanding models. And I'm sure we'll touch on that again, how important teachers, coaches, leaders can be in terms of shaping, a young person and putting young people on a positive trajectory. And so I had parents that were really interested and engaged in raising their children and trying to instill all the right virtues and values. And there are also, in my youth, some outstanding Little League coaches and CYO coaches, playground directors. And that was a theme kind of throughout my life, is older people that have life experience that took the time to build my confidence and to put me on the right path, and all the way through to Coach Keady, who I met obviously down the line. So my father and my 3 older brothers all played basketball. And so I think that's where the natural inclination to want to pick up that ball, as you said, and try and put it through the hoop came from, because I watched them as a youngster. And then 4th grade, probably around 10 years old, is when I first played organized basketball, and initially didn't really have a good experience. There was someone on the team that had the green light because his father was coaching, and I liked to play defense. I was a transporter, but didn't have a great experience. But as the years went by and I gained confidence and developed my skills, then my love of the game was at a higher level. And then I was fortunate to go to a high school up here, Sir Francis Drake High School, outstanding coach. George Lewis was my frosh soft JV coach, but Pete Hayward in this area was really successful, and one of the best coaches. And we won a couple state championships. We were 65-1 over 2 years, 31-1 my junior year, and 34-0 my senior year. We won 58 straight games over that period. So I was a role player, and happy to be on the team. And because of that success, that's another reason my interest in basketball continued to build. And then I played basketball at San Francisco State under coach named Lyle Damon my freshman year, then Kevin Wilson my sophomore year, and then Coach Wilson left to Chapman University after a Elite 8 Division II NCAA tournament run our team had, the Gators. and he had an opportunity to go to Chapman. So I ended up following him because I had an interest in coaching. He was my mentor. So I finished at Chapman. And after graduating, I was fortunate. It's a long story, but it ultimately came to Purdue and had 3 years under Gene Keady in the Big Ten. And that's when, of course, Matt Painter and I crossed paths. Right. I think it was my second year when he arrived at Purdue. And Matt Waddell also was on that team. Chucky White, Steve Scheffler, a good group. And then had an opportunity to come back west to get closer to my family, and ended up spending 12 years at UCLA. And then I was at TV for 7 years with ABC, ESPN. Then I got back in coaching at St. John's for 5 years. And then now I've been at Fox Sports and doing the NCAA tournament with CBS and Turner in the postseason for the past 5 years. So the years go by, but it all started in terms of my professional career at Purdue in 1988 when Coach Keady gave me the opportunity of a lifetime to join the Boilermaker staff. And Bruce Weber was an assistant, Dave Wood, Frank Kendrick, Tom Ryder. So they were like older brothers. And once again, I was the youngest. And that's a theme too, because I was the youngest assistant at Purdue. I was the youngest assistant at UCLA, and then the youngest head coach at UCLA. But what's interesting is now I'm the old guy. It's amazing how that happens.
How did you, and I mean, just curious, I mean, like you said, being a young guy and just being right out of Chapman, you said, I mean, you 22, 23 years old. How do you get a bit? I mean, Purdue had just won back. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Purdue had just won back-to-back Big Ten championships. How do you get from Chapman to Indiana? How do you even know to even try to get to Indiana?
Yeah, good question. Well, my college coach, Kevin Wilson, had grown up in the Midwest. He played at Ashland College and was under Bill Musselman. And then he later was an assistant for Bill Musselman at Minnesota when they had Kevin McHale and Flip Saunders and Dave Winfield and Mark Landsberger and some other outstanding players. And so when Kevin Wilson was out west and I was playing for him at San Francisco State and at Chapman, he'd always talk about Big Ten basketball and the great rivalries. And from Johnny Orr, who was at Michigan, back in the day, to Coach Keady, to Bobby Knight, to Judd Heathcote, Tom Davis. So hearing those stories about Big Ten basketball is what initially piqued my interest. And then I later started writing letters to coaches throughout the country. Jerry Tarkanian at UNLV, Coach Keady at Purdue, Mike Krzyzewski at Duke, and Bobby Knight at Indiana. And there were other coaches, aren't as well known. Hank Egan at San Diego, Jim Brandenburg was at San Diego State. So I started pen paling with these coaches because I aspired to someday be a coach, and I wanted advice or direction in terms of, books I should read, camps I should attend, clinics I should, attend. And then over the period of those 2 years, the opportunity came about to where I could actually go back and visit the programs and spend time. And that's what led to a visit in the 87-88 season. I spent a month in Indiana with Coach Knight and his staff. I just kind of couch surfed. I lived with Brian Sloan and Cree Smith. I was in their apartment. Craig Hartman, who was a manager at the time, later an assistant coach at Indiana, also was really helpful. Ron Felling, let me stay at his place some. And, Dan Dockich was on that staff, and Joby Wright, Tate's Lock. And so had a, great introduction to Big Ten basketball at Indiana. And Coach Knight let me sit on the bench for the home games and was able to get in the locker room pregame, halftime, and postgame, and, was able to break down film with the staff. So he, was someone I learned a great deal from. And then I went to Purdue, did the same thing with the Boilermakers. And Kevin Stallings was an assistant at the time, and Bruce Weber and Tom Ryder, Dave Wood. They really embraced me. And Coach Keady allowed me to have another, fully immersed experience in Boilermaker basketball. Then I went back, finished up school, and then started sending resumes out, with my cover letters. And fortunately, Kevin Stallings went to Kansas as an assistant when Roy Williams was hired by the Jayhawks. And that presented an opening for me to get a foot in the door at Purdue 33 years ago. And everything from there just kind of flowed. I met Coach Wooden while I was at Purdue because he would come back when he was getting honored. And that played a part in me going to UCLA, and definitely was instrumental in eventually becoming the head coach at UCLA. Right. Because Coach Wooden's advocacy and the ties to Indiana and the Big Ten and his love of Purdue, and also his love of language. My dad was an English teacher and Coach Wooden was an English teacher. So there are just a lot of kind of common threads, even though he was from a different generation. He was born in 1910 in Indiana and passed away in 2010, just short of his 100th birthday. But again, back to Coach Keady and the opportunity to come visit and then ultimately join his staff is what led to meeting Coach Wooden. And that was a game changer in terms of his influence and just the doors that it opened, and eventually the opportunity to coach at UCLA.
Right. No, that's amazing stuff. I mean, there's so many different things you can hit on in what you just said. Just first thing I want to hit on is just because so many people could learn from what you did. You didn't sit around and wait for somebody to come to you. You said you wrote letters. You was pen pal. So especially in this age of technology, there's no reason why someone can't get to where they want to get to if they put in the work. Because I mean, for you to go out and seek mentorship, I mean, it just because trying to talk about what mentorship means to you and kind of where it's gotten you. I know you've mentioned a lot of mentors, but does it mean something specific to you, mentorship?
Yeah, I think, people that have life experience can be assets. They can be so helpful. In a way, they can cut your tuition in half, where you don't have to maybe make the mistakes. If you have great mentors, by them sharing their experiences, we can avoid some pitfalls. We still learn most through trial and error in any industry, in any craft, in any vocation, any walk of life. It's the hardship, it's the adversity that informs, more powerful, perspective. Right. And so I just think, having people in your corner and having advocates and having people who've lived life and have more wisdom, more experience, and to be able to tap into that. There's no greater curriculum. And so often it's things, you can't learn in a classroom. It's not the textbook that you buy at the bookstore. These are real life experiences, and they're brought to life in a three-dimensional way by your mentors. And, parents, teachers, coaches, again, playground directors, mentorship can come in a lot of forms, but it basically is people that care and believe in you. And sometimes mentors are, providing you direction and some discipline and putting a fire under your fanny. Other times they're encouraging you or providing courage when you may not have it yourself. And that's what encouragement is really about. And having a feel for when to put an arm around someone because they need that encouragement and love, and also when to put a fire under their fanny and to let them know, what's unacceptable. And when they're out of bounds, they got to get back in bounds or get back on track. And so it's a feel. And I think just like parenting, you get better. My parents would always talk about, they were learning as they went with the 6 children. It's trial and error, and they were becoming better parents by the 4th child, the 5th child, and the 6th child. And I think coaching is the same. If I look back at my career, independent of the records, because you can have a great record, make a deep run in the NCAA tournament, but just be scratching the surface in terms of your full potential as a coach. Right. And players as well. They could be putting up big numbers offensively, but not be a complete player. And then as the years go by and they understand the subtleties of their position and how to add value as a teammate, how to be a better leader, and how to set their teammates up to play to those strengths, those are things as a player. And I think as a coach, we get better. As parents, we get better. As leaders, we get better. And that's if you're interested. You don't get better if you're not continuing to work at it. But if you're interested in your craft, your vocation, your profession, whether you're a musician, an artist, right, a vocalist, a coach, a teacher, you're going to get better. Right. And so mentors set that example by the way they lead their life. And I've been fortunate to have remarkable mentors, from my parents to Coach Keady, to Coach Wooden, to Coach Herrick. And then there are even some mentors, again, that aren't well known in terms of, from a public perspective, but has as much influence as any.
100%. No, 100%. And I've had one of my mentors, Jared Quarles, Brian Rogers, I've had the same mentors, probably 10, 11 years old. So, it's something that for me, in the age of technology so much, I can look above it, because I've had people, like you said, when I'm out of bounds, they put me in it, put me back in bounds, because it's big. And it's the reason why I started my camps. It's because I had someone to give back to me and put me in place and kind of show me the way. So it's the reason I put together my basketball camps, to kind of give back and show other kids the way. And speaking of basketball camps, we have our summer basketball camp coming up June 21st there in West Lafayette, June 21st, June 24th. I forgot to throw that in there. But going back to coaching, going back to just now again, you got to Purdue, you're 22, 23, 24 years old. They just won two Big Ten championships. I'm just thinking of me as a player. How do you come in and gain respect from those guys as the new guy, as the young guy? Out the seniors, the juniors, the guys that's been there for a while, the guys that may even be your age.
Yeah, good question. I think number one, you hit the nail on the head with that word respect. It begins by showing respect to the coaching staff who had prior experience, at Purdue. And so following their lead and, taking cues from them in terms of what's important to Coach Keady, and, also finding out how I could add some value, and also showing respect to the players in terms of being interested and taking time to engage with them and listen and, provide the perspective that I was capable of giving for that juncture at my life. And again, as you mentioned, I wasn't, too many years older than them. Yeah. And so I think, listening is something that, I think is as important as any attribute that there is. And, so I was someone that listened and learned through observing and asking questions. And that's how you build your knowledge base. And in particular, when you're around, the Jerry Tarkanians and Tim Gergoviches and Coach K's and Gene Keady's and Bobby Knight's and John Wooden's, it'd be foolish to not be all ears, and also to not formulate and ask meaningful questions, because, we're only here so long, and you want to, take full advantage of those rare opportunities where you can learn from some of the best in the history of this game. And so I think I came in as a listener, and then also, took direction from the staff, Coach Keady being the boss, but also, Bruce Weber and Tom Ryder and Dave Wood, and then later Frank Kendrick. Right. And so Coach Keady, gave his assistants a lot of latitude in terms of being able to teach and coach. So I was able to get on the floor, and, my specialty was, on the defensive side of the ball, because those are the coaches I studied, all defensive coaches. And while there was a variety of approaches and styles of, employing defenses at those respective programs that I spent time with, like, different jazz, right? Different, flavors, I was, always taking notes because I knew at some point I'd be a head coach and bringing those principles forward and developing my own philosophy. Because ultimately, you got to be yourself. You can learn from others, emulate others, borrow some ideas, like a recipe here and there that you add into your own cookbook, but it has to be your cookbook. And otherwise, you're not going to be comfortable. And you got to be comfortable in your own skin, be true to yourself and do the things you believe in. But I think humility and listening and learning and being open with a flexible mindset is how you build your knowledge base. And that in turn then helps in terms of achieving, in terms of, aspiring to certain goals, and then trying to pass that on to your players who carry it forward and hopefully do the same someday and passing it on to the next generation. And but I think at Purdue, my area of specialty, my responsibility was on the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, there was some scouting, game preparation. Coach Keady expected us to get on the floor and be able to teach all the drills. He also gave us responsibility to go out and speak to donors and boosters. And he wanted us to also work with the media and be involved, kind of like gang tackling in every aspect of the program. When someone came in for a visit, you wanted to engage, even if you weren't the number one assistant in charge of recruiting, you expect a collective effort for everyone to engage with that recruit, that prospect, and their family, so they have a better experience and are more likely to come to Purdue and help our cause in terms of competing in the Big Ten and trying to win championships. So that was helpful. And interestingly, Jim Herrick was very similar in terms of latitude. Him and Coach Keady are dramatically different in terms of, their sideline demeanor and their overall philosophies. But where they were similar was expecting the assistants to learn every aspect of what it takes to be a head coach. And that closes the gap, cuts the tuition in half on the transition. It better prepares you for that day when you do become a head coach.
That reminds me a lot. Just when you think about Purdue, just to Coach Paint, because every single one of my assistant coaches from my freshman year now are head coaches. You got Coach Shrewsbury at Penn State. You got Coach Owens at Miami of Ohio. You got Coach G, who's down at Mercer. So it's kind of similar to what Payne does. You see giving the guys coach responsibility. You see them handing over the clipboard. When you're an assistant, does that empower you? Or because if I'm looking back, if I would have never, honestly, I don't know much about Coach Keady, but I would have never really thought that way. If you look at the sideline demeanor and kind of the aggressiveness, did that empower you to kind of do more as an assistant when he would empower you in a sense?
Definitely. He is very humble, hardworking. He's intense, a fierce competitor, as intense as any coach in the history of college basketball. Yeah. And I rank him right at the top in terms of getting the most out of his teams. There are other coaches, Pete Newell, also really maximized, his personnel in terms of getting the most out of them. And that's really what coaching's about. Your personnel changes from year to year. And so you have to make adjustments. And I think Coach Keady's flexible mindset and his humility is one of his true gifts. And he's got a great sense of humor, and humor and humility are related. So he shows deference to others. He can laugh at himself. And I think that's one of his gifts. And what makes him so real and appealing to others is, he's never too big for his britches. He can get a kick out of himself. He can laugh at his circumstances, even when, the circumstances are such that, it's not what he would ideally want, but, even after a tough loss, he would grade us and then put us back, recalibrate our mindset, put us back on track in terms of building confidence and making us believe that we could still do special things that season. So he was sometimes at his best in the darkest moments. I thought, his best coaching was after tough losses, and his resiliency was remarkable. His bounce back. I think that's maybe the greatest gift that I took from him was his resiliency, just that spirit. He wasn't going to be denied in pursuing goals and aspiring towards excellence independent of the odds or the obstacles or the tough breaks that would come his way or our way as a program. He was hard charging and leading from the front in terms of his example. And really, it was that energy and passion, that will that he had that set him apart from others. But yeah, so, he expected us to pitch in. And so whether it was even USA basketball, because he coached a lot of teams for our country, and expecting our staff to jump in. He took me with him to Colorado Springs for the trials.
Right.
And that built my confidence, because you're working with all the best players in the country. And he led those teams to gold medals. But so no doubt at a young age, having a coach that believed in you and gave you responsibility and listened, he listened to us in staff meetings when we were putting together our practice plans, when we were talking about what we might do based on matchups, with an opponent, and things we could modify or tweak. And again, that thinking creatively to find a way to win a game, thinking creatively with a fresh and original outlook so that you stay ahead of the curve. And if you don't keep evolving as a coach, as a program, then eventually you get passed by. So that's the wonderful thing about team sports, and basketball in particular is, in its purest form, it's a metaphor for life. In other words, the things that you've learned by going to Purdue and the things I learned by being an assistant at Purdue carry forward. Like, those are attributes, traits, qualities, characteristics, preparation, attention to detail, being a good teammate, sustaining your intensity, being a great listener, intensity and intelligence. You need both, passion, but also purpose. And so those qualities that Coach Keady instilled in his staff members and his players, they allow you to have a sustainable career, whether you're in basketball or some other industry.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I 100% agree. I always tell guys, Purdue prepared me to be a professional basketball player, but it prepared me to be a professional. Coach Paint would always say, be a professional at your role, or be a professional at anything you do. Because like you said earlier, your high school having success, winning some state championships, brought you more personal success. And like, with the way you go about it, and the way you go about your role, and the way you go about carrying yourself, no matter what you're doing, always be a pro. And that's something I learned from Paint, because I was able to go from basketball, high major basketball, to selling a sales career with Eli Lilly in the doctor's offices. And this translated just from being professional and just being a pro at whatever I was going to put my foot in. So everything you're saying, I feel like, the way you're describing Paint, I just did it. The way you're describing Keady, it's like the same way I could describe Coach Paint. It's the same exact things I learned at Purdue, like what you said about listening. Paint would always say listening is a skill. He would always say you have to learn how to listen. He would always say listening will take you further. And that was one of the reasons I became a captain, is because I just tried to do everything they would say. Because I just, like, you were a defensive master, I sucked at defense. And if there was a time where I didn't know what was going on, I'm just going to stop and I'm going to ask what's going on. I don't know, tell me. And it got to the point where they called me the worst defender, and I just listened to everything they said, and I became Defensive Player of the Year the next year. So everything you're saying, 30 years later, it stood true to my time at Purdue. And while you were there, I'm just curious, do you have any games that you remember, or any IU moments that you remember from your time at Purdue, your 3 years?
Boy, that first year we actually struggled. And so it was an opportunity to learn, because Coach Keady was on a roll there with the Big Ten championships. Yep. And then we had a season where, things just didn't line up. We didn't have the cohesiveness. And so there wasn't the margin for error. You mentioned Troy Lewis, Everett Stevens, Todd Mitchell, Tony Jones, Melvin McCants, Kip Jones, Steve Scheffler. There was that team prior to my first year. It had a really good run. And then we still had, Scheffler and Kip Jones and Melvin McCants and Tony Jones, but the big three had moved on. And so while you know, the players that returned were important pieces in those championship seasons. They were more complementary pieces because Troy, Todd, and Everett, right? They really dominated in terms of, you know, shots and scoring and having the ball in their hands and growing into being the leaders that Coach Keady expected them to be. So that next year, we had the complementary pieces that returned from those successful seasons. And then we had a bunch of newcomers. And the chemistry just didn't ever connect. There just wasn't the flow that you need. And you're in the Big Ten, strong conferences there is in the country. And so you're playing with a razor thin margin for error. And so we ended up having a losing season. If I'm not mistaken, we might have been, you know, like one game below 500, didn't go to NIT, didn't go to an NCAA tournament. But that really led to, again, Coach Keady doing his best work, and also the leaders that came back the next year. We finished second place. And there was a game at Michigan State in my second season. It was the last game of the regular season with the Big Ten championship on the line. And Steve Smith, Kirk Mans, I think, also was up there at that point. I'm trying to think if Dwayne Stevens was playing on those teams. But Michigan State had a really strong team. And we lost a heartbreaker up there. There were some calls down the stretch that didn't go our way. And Coach Keady to this day still talks about those calls. I think Eddie Hightower had that game, and he never let Eddie Hightower forget it, saying that he owed us a Big Ten championship ring. And always reminding him, you know, you still owe me a Big Ten championship ring because you stole mine, you know. But that was a really memorable game. And, you know, all the Indiana games, you know, in Bloomington and at Mackey was electric, always is, but in particular when Indiana comes in, as you know, in my book, the greatest rivalry in college basketball, and there's others, North Carolina and Duke, but UCLA, USC. But my book, for a number of reasons, Purdue IU is the most unique of all. That's for another podcast down the line. We'll have that conversation. But and winning in Bloomington probably is more rewarding because it's so tough. And that's what's remarkable about this run that Matt Painter's had. He's the Hoosier Slayer. I mean, maybe in the history of the rivalry, I don't know if anyone's ever done what Matt Painter's done in terms of the consecutive victories. And maybe if we go way, way back when the scores were 11-7, or, you know, at the turn of the century or something. But, but, you know, this is really a unique scenario, and it should be appreciated, not taken for granted, because, you know, Purdue has just been blitzing Indiana, and it really hasn't been a rivalry, because to be a rivalry, you know, you have to be competitive. And for a long stretch here, that rivalry has not been competitive. And I think Coach Painter, he doesn't want to lose to IU, but he'd probably even like to see the rivalry get elevated back to where it was during the Gene Keady, Bobby Knight era, or even early in, you know, Coach Painter's tenure when it was more competitive. But that speaks to Matt's gifts as a coach, and also recruiting. You know, he's kind of dominated the recruiting, you know, in terms of the landscape in Indiana and the Midwest. And when you start sending guys, you know, to the NBA and you're winning championships and making runs in the tournament, all those things fuel the program for greater success. And so Matt's got it rolling right now. And also Matt navigated through some tough seasons, and very similar to Coach Keady, and Purdue was smart enough to stay with him and stay the course, because if you have a good fit, you may think the grass is greener, but it's an old be careful what you wish for. You run out the guy who's actually better positioned and knows the program and its history and the conference better than anyone that's out there as a hot candidate. And so you may sign a hot candidate and have a nice honeymoon at the press conference, but then the work begins. And if you don't have someone like a Gene Keady or a Matt Painter, and you've lost them or let them go, that can often come back to really haunt a program for decades or more. And so I think, you know, Matt navigated that tough period masterfully. He was, you know, open and flexible in terms of the adjustments he had to make, both in terms of his staff and recruiting. And that's what a great leader does. is he evaluates, assesses the situation, and makes those adjustments, modifies from a strategic standpoint what he has to do. And that's like a CEO. That's what really Matt is, but of a basketball program. And so infrastructure, personnel, staffing, all those things, and talent. Let's face it, you got to be able to sign good basketball players if you're going to win games. The X's and O's are important, but it's the Jimmies and the Joes. If you look through the history of Purdue, when they've been at their best, they've had good players. And when we've struggled, we didn't have the level of personnel, the margin for error, and then on top of it, the chemistry. Yeah. So Matt is a perfect balance of, he understands strategy, X's and O's, adjustments, has a feel for the game, a feel for his personnel, a great motivator, and also makes the adjustments both in game and from game to game and from season to season, because your roster is changing. And then also evaluating talent in terms of staff, what assistants to bring in and how they're going to work together, because they have to have chemistry as well. And then also evaluating players, prospects, and blending, right? Players that, have NBA talent, but then also getting those role players. I call it the tortoises and the hares. You need enough 4-5-year players that they redshirt that give you continuity and stability and really sustain your culture, because they understand what's expected. But then you also got to recruit some guys who can come in right now and impact that may leave after a couple of years. They may have a chance to go early, and that's a good thing. And so I think, like a portfolio, you want to blend and balance, from a financial standpoint. You sit down with an investor, they always talk about balance, not putting, putting all your money in one side of things from a financial standpoint. So Matt's done that well when you look at his rosters in terms of players and his staff. And he's, on a trajectory to go to the Hall of Fame. And I think a couple of years ago, if they don't get the bad bounce against Virginia, that could be a national championship team. So there'd already be one banner up there, and it would, squash any of the ridiculous chatter about, he can't win the big one, because he's won so many big ones. It's crazy. I've lost track of how many big ones he's won. But people have that mindset that if you don't get to a Final Four, you don't win at all, then it's a bust. Right. And people forget, that Jim Calhoun went years before he could win the big one. And then once he punched through, he went to, 4 or 5 Final Fours and won 3 national titles. Gary Williams, they said, couldn't win the big one. And then in 2001, he goes to the Final Four. In 2002, he wins it. John Wooden didn't win a championship at UCLA until his 16th season. He was 53 years old before he won his first title. And then once he got that first one, it ended up leading to 10 out of 12 and 7 in a row and 4 undefeated seasons and 88 consecutive wins at one point, still a record on the men's basketball side. But people forget, he was working at his craft. He started at Dayton, Kentucky as a high school, English teacher and coach. Then he was at South Bend Central High School as a coach and English teacher. Then he went to Indiana State when it was a teacher's college, Division II, before they weren't the Larry Bird Sycamores at that point. Right. But he worked on his craft some more. He was also in the service, served our country in the Navy. And that obviously is an education in and of itself. Right. And then he comes to UCLA in the late 40s. And he doesn't get that first championship till the mid 60s. And he retires in 1975 with his last of the 10 championships. But he went, 15 years with very mediocre results. And they stayed the course with him, and it paid dividends with 10 out of 12. But he admits he was learning. He likes to kid. He'd say, Steve, I was a slow learner, with the twinkle in his blue eyes. You start to see the grin. And he said, but once I figured it out, I was pretty good. and it's the understatement, obviously, of the history of coaching. Right. And he was tweaking and modifying the full court press. Was an important weapon, the 2-2-1 press. And his first championship was small ball. They didn't have anyone over 6'5" on the roster. So 64, 65, they were doing what Golden State Warriors are doing, but they didn't have a 3-point line or a clock back then. Right. But through the press, they really took off. he wanted to play fast break basketball because Piggy Lambert, his mentor at Purdue, hence Lambert Fieldhouse. Matter of fact, Piggy Lambert actually had a ball, you know, like there's Spalding and Wilson. Piggy Lambert was so big time, and he coached John Wooden that he had one of those balls that had the laces in it, almost like a football does.
Yeah,
you know, now
yeah,
that's how far back things were. Coach Wooden was there from 1928 to 32 at Purdue. I don't know if Orville Redenbacher was his classmate or not, but I know Orville Redenbacher and other Boilermakers, you know. I mean, we got such a range, right? Putting guys on the moon, popcorn popping, Coach Wooden with his championships, and Coach Keady, now Coach Painter, but so many great alums, you know, when you look at the history of Purdue. But yeah, learning and growing is really important. And I think the schools that have stayed the course, Calhoun at Connecticut, Jim Boeheim at Syracuse, Krzyzewski at Duke, Dean Smith and Roy Williams at North Carolina, Lute Olson at Arizona, you know, the Heathcote passed the baton to Tom Izzo. Those runs are, you know, a result of the continuity. They're not turning over their coaching staff every couple of years. And just like musicians, you know, the longer they play together, right, the better the music. The more you rehearse and practice together, then, you know, the performance is going to be elevated. That doesn't mean there aren't dips on occasion, because it's a competitive world. So teams are going to have a bad stretch where the group just doesn't realize their potential, or, you know, your assessment as a coach was off base, you know, in terms of who you bring in. And if you miss in this business and you're in the Big Ten on one recruiting class, that can cost you a season or two before you recover. Now, the transfer portal's changed things a little bit, where you can, you know, change your roster in a more, you know, quick fashion than past years, because you got kids coming in that don't even have to sit out, play right away. The graduate transfers, the COVID situations led to the transfer portal having 11 or 1,200 people in it this year. So that's probably been the biggest change. You know, way back early 80s, the shot clock was a revolutionary change. 87, the three-point line was a revolutionary change. And I'd say right now, the biggest change is the transfer portal, the transfer market, kind of the equivalent of free agency, but in college athletics. And how people respond to that, take advantage of that, will go a long way to determine whether or not they continue to have success.
What do you feel about the portal? Because I mean, like you said, I never really thought about the shot clock the game not having a shot clock before it did. So these moments in the game where things change, what do you see happening from the portal? What are your initial thoughts of it? Because like you said, there are over 1,000 kids in the portal. So.
Yeah, I think number one, it's not shocking, but it is surprising, you know. And the reason to me it's not shocking is we've seen that trend through the years in terms of, you know, people transferring more frequently. And I think it starts with, you know, high schools where, you know, you'll see, you know, athletes transfer more frequently because maybe they feel the program's not a good fit. You know, they've got issues with the coach, or they're incentivized to go to another program, maybe, you know, a combination of factors. And also in the summertime, right, you'll see frequent changes, the different shoe companies, the different AAU programs, and someone will, you know, be with Under Armour one year, and then they're with Nike, and then the next year they're with Adidas. And so, you know, starting with youth basketball, then summertime AAU basketball, and high school, it's just more prevalent. And so I think people become kind of numb, and it's just status quo that people are transferring left and right. And so now it's carried over to college, where, you know, it might be you want to go play with a friend on the other side of the country, you know, and they're texting each other, keeping in touch with social media, and they hang out in the summertime. And then it's like, man, you should come play for us, you know. And there was less of that. That was a really rare occasion when I got in the business in the 80s through the 90s, even the, you know, early 2000s. But in the last 10 years and these last couple years, it's really gone to another level. It's transfers, you know, on steroids in terms of the frequency.
Oh yeah, I agree. Yeah, in the last, I came into Purdue around 2012, and since then, every year, like you said, the last 10 years and the last few years, it's kind of amped. But I just was more curious to see kind of the thoughts about it, because it is a big change, and it does give, like you just said, a point that I haven't heard anybody talk about. It gives the players the power to kind of recruit other players. So it will be a big shift. And
yeah, I think not to cut you off. I'm sorry. Finish that.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Cut you off on the baseline there. See, there's my quick feet. So, I think one of the elements that's come out of the transfer portal and something to consider is coaches have to check their whole card, as Coach Keady used to like to say. And I'm saying this as, someone that coached for 20 plus years.
Right.
And so I'm including myself, that we're at this critical intersection or juncture, and, numbers and analytics, right, are an indication of something, and finding out why and looking into that. There are some, like the things I just mentioned, but I also think that there's something to be said for coming at young people in a different way, finding, fresh and original ways to connect, to engage, to show interest. And I mean authentically, not just, okay, come over to the house with the team and we're going to, have some burgers and you get to watch an NFL game or two and think that's it. You kind of check that box that you're really engaged and showing interest and have an idea of what's going on with your players in terms of their struggles, mental health issues, challenges at home, the number of things that a young person is trying to balance as a student athlete, his academic load, the pressure to perform at a high level. And so I think more one-on-one time, just like, when parents drop in and they get that quality time with one of their children for a full day, uninterrupted, unfettered, and not distracted by the phone or work, but fully engaged and doing more of that, the entire coaching staff with young people. Doesn't guarantee that some won't still transfer, but I think you would see a difference. And I know at St. John's, my second tour of duty and coaching, I made a conscious effort to spend time with my players away from campus, away from the locker room, because when you're traveling with your team, there's some pockets, and I think those are valuable too, to connect with your players, on a layover in terms of a connecting flight or on the bus rides or, at the various stops when you're getting a bite to eat. But spending that time away from campus, away from the locker room, away from your office with players. And for me, if it was spring or summer, I'd meet them in Central Park. We'd go for long walks in Central Park. Yeah. Or if it was during the year, we'd get together and, I was living in the Village, we'd drop in and listen to some jazz at a cool little jazz spot. Or there might be an exhibit in Soho or Tribeca, interesting art exhibit, or an exhibit at the Whitney, and or having them come over and spend the night, or spend the weekend. And so that I found was a real difference maker. And it doesn't mean you still didn't have challenges with players. I think we had maybe 3 transfers in the 5 years. UCLA, I might have had 2 or 3. And again, it was different eras, but I think I've had 5 or 6 transfers in my entire coaching career. And I think one of the reasons is, I did my best, wasn't perfect, to really engage. And there's still players that aren't happy. There's still players that I wasn't able to reach or bring forth their full potential or get them closer to their full potential. No one ever reaches their full potential, but the idea is, let's get individual players and then the group collectively closer to the full potential or full expression of their potential. And that's really what I was after. And I knew the winning would be a result of that approach. We still got to organize, we still got to discipline them, you still got to condition them. And, you still got to be well prepared. You still got to, from a crisis management standpoint, be flexible and be ready to put out fires. And there's all the complexities that come with being a head coach. But I do think that's an aspect that right now coaches throughout the country need to really examine. I'll give you an example. John Wooden in the springtime at UCLA would always audit a psychology class. And because we had, great professors, right, in every subject, history, philosophy, English, but also psychology. And he wanted to audit those classes, sit in on psychology classes, because he knew that he was getting older. And by being engaged in a class where there's 18 to 22-year-olds that are taking a psychology class, and these psychologists or psychology teachers who were experts really in the realm of people and motivation and, what works, what are the trends. And Coach Wooden was getting older, but he was continuing to work with the same age group. And so to bridge that gap, he made strategic hires in terms of his assistant coaches and former players that then came under his tutelage as assistant coaches. That was one way to bridge the gap. And the other was staying on top of psychology. And that's pretty forward thinking, progressive thinking for a guy that was born in 1910 in Indiana. But I think it's also why he, was successful coaching guys that came back from Normandy and Iwo Jima in World War II, but also coached during Vietnam. And he coached during the drug experimentation and the sexual revolution, civil rights. I mean, he was coaching during really interesting times in our country, and yet he was so old-fashioned with his virtues and values that he believed in from his Midwest upbringing and his faith. And but I also think, his flexibility. We talked about that earlier with Coach Keady and Coach Painter, that you've got to be open and have a flexible mindset so you can adapt and adjust to the changing times as you get older, but continue to coach younger people. And I think right now, the coaches throughout the country would be wise to take John Wooden's lead and, start to not only rely on this, school counselors and psychologists. That's important. Take advantage of those resources because they're expert in that area, but also do a deep dive yourself on what's going on in our culture and with young people, and just, be interested in them, but also in the psychology. What are the best methods, right? The best techniques to be able to establish rapport and establish trust. And again, back to authenticity. It can't just be, having them over for a picnic, a barbecue in the backyard, and then you think you've checked that for another 6 months. Yeah. It's got to be a constant. And I'm not saying it's easy because as a head coach, you're juggling so many aspects. There are so many demands on your time. But I think we sometimes get away from remembering the most important aspect is the student athletes that you're responsible for. And I think it happens with parents, right? Sometimes we forget our children are the most important aspect. And we lose, that frequency, that line of communication. And so I think that would not eliminate transfers, but I think it would diminish the numbers that we're seeing. And that's assistant coaches too. It's the entire program, operations people, video coordinators, your trainers. I mean, there's got to be complete buy-in. And so athletic programs should probably be investing money, whether it's having, experts come in and address coaches, there's the women's side, there's the men's side, right? There's all these different things that are going on. And I think that is really what I feel most strongly about when it comes to that subject that we're speaking about here on the transfer portal.
No, I agree. I 100% wholeheartedly agree. And I think that's the reason why, like, you see guys because one thing that I always appreciate that Paint started to do, like you said, I was a part of those rookies we had. So after that, I remember bring in a guy, we take personality tests and just try to figure out he would always say, each person is different. I have to coach each person different. He'd always say, I can't coach Rapheal the same way I coach AJ Hammonds. I need to know how to talk to him differently. They were raised differently. So, you know what I mean? So Paint, it was always up on that type of stuff, what you're saying. I think that's one of the reasons, he's having continued success even with younger guys. So, you think about kind of the same thing you're talking about. We're from going from coaching with Carl Landry and those dudes, and now with Carson Edwards and this group, these last few groups. So, it's just being able to go with the kids and go with the flow, not fall into himself. Because I remember one thing Paint would always say was, I'm not in the business of coaching. I'm in the business of people.
Mm-hmm.
He would always get to know his players. He always, I mean, even after my sophomore year, I mean, just being transparent. My sophomore year, we come last place in the Big Ten. I think I'm averaging 17, 18 minutes a game. I was playing more my freshman year than I was my sophomore year, maybe just by a little bit, but it felt that way. But I mean, I just didn't have a good year. I wanted to transfer. I mean, just the kid in me wanted to transfer, but I liked the staff. I liked Coach Owens. I knew Coach Owens since I was 14, 15 years old. I knew he cared. You know what I mean? It wasn't that I wanted to transfer. I only stayed and didn't transfer because of what you're saying. I knew they cared about me. I knew that at the end of the day, it wasn't that they didn't like me. It's not that they didn't want me there. Honestly, I just wasn't good enough on defense. So when you have those type of coaches that, like a Coach Owens, that will show you that he cares about you, at the end of the year, you're not thinking, oh, they don't like me, I have to leave. So it's all about everything what you're saying. That's it. Like, to this day, I just talked to Coach Owens yesterday. So it's one of those things where at Purdue, I felt invested in, especially like not just from Coach Paint, but from Coach Owens, Coach Brantley. The list goes on. Coach G. I mean, Coach Shrewsbury. Coach Shrewsbury coached me my freshman year at Purdue. Then after that, he went with Brad Stevens to the Celtics my sophomore year. But when I graduated from Purdue, he was still with the Celtics, and I moved to Atlanta. I started working for Eli Lilly. I reached out to Coach Shrewsbury. I see the Celtics are coming in town. It's one text message. Coach Shrewsbury leaves me, my fiance, tickets, and we have a good night at the game. So it's one of those things where at Purdue, I always felt as though whether you're playing or whether you're not, like my sophomore year to my junior year, the love and how the coaches feel about you doesn't change. And that's the reason I didn't. We had guys transfer out. I can't speak for them. That's one of the reasons I didn't transfer. So that was that's crazy that you say that, because that's what I felt. That's how I felt Purdue started to move when we started to think of Chad Brown. I think we started to do those disc tests. I think they were called. No, I know. I just have a few more questions for you. Just going off of Twitter, I threw it out there for some of the Twitter fans and whatnot. I had a good question come back from your commentating career, because I know you started commentating 2003-ish. What's the best game you've seen live, or the best performance by a player you've seen live?
Wow. Well, as a coach, my assistant years at UCLA, Jason Kidd was in our conference at Cal Berkeley. And I'd say Jason Kidd, in terms of just, sitting on the bench courtside, watching him go up and down the floor and the things he was doing to influence the game in a positive manner for the Cal Bears, both offensively and defensively, were just off the hinges. It was, you knew that you were watching a Hall of Fame basketball player. Wow. And he was like a one-man press in terms of just ball hawking. And then he also was like a defensive back in terms of the way he would bait someone to, throw a pass, because he knew he could close down on it so quickly and just feast on people's passes if they weren't really sharp and didn't have velocity on them, or if they were telegraphed. And but he would almost give someone some room, so it presented the illusion that they were open, and then he knew he could close down and steal the ball and then bring it the other way, and either finish himself or drop a precise dime, because it was surgery when Jason Kidd was out there with the ball in his hands, and he could just cut you up. Ray Allen, in the NCAA tournament, 1995, we played UConn in the Oakland Coliseum in the Elite Eight to go to the Final Four. And it was just a shootout. Kevin Ollie was the point guard. Ray Allen was at the wing. Donnie Marshall was a four-man. Deron Sheffer, I think, was lock and load and bombing threes. They were a really good team and played at pace. They were the first team that wanted to run with us because they thought they could outrun us. And Jim Calhoun even said it that week, like, hey, we're not slowing it down. They haven't seen the way we run, And that's what I love about Coach Calhoun. He's got so much swag and confidence, because so often coaches will sandbag and do the Lou Holtz and, well, we're not that good. We don't have the talent, to play against these teams, but our system's going to try and carry us through. Calhoun was just saying, like, hey, we're badass. We're going to run them out of the gym. And of course that inspired us, bulletin board material. Now it's on, and it was a shootout. I forget the final score, but it was, high octane, one of the more entertaining. We had Tyus Edney and Ed O'Bannon and Toby Bailey and J.R. Henderson, George Zedek, Cameron Dollar. This game was just played at a breakneck pace. And Ray Allen was another player who you were just like, what? The shots that he was making, because we had the lead, but they kept coming. And we ended up winning, going to the Final Four, winning the national championship. But in that game, we think that we had a comfortable lead, and then Ray Allen would just start doing crazy things and making shots. And we were well prepared, on all his catches. We were going to show him a crowd. We were going to hard hedge or blitz and double on ball screens. And we had, different coverages ready for him.
Right.
And, I'll never forget, because he had a run where he made 8 straight points, hit a shot right in front of our bench where his heels, of his sneakers were, almost on the sideline out of bounds, right in front of our bench. And it's fully contested. I think Charles O'Bannon or someone had a high hand, on the closeout, and, nothing but net. And, Coach Herrick calls a timeout, and, might have been a 30. And he's, jumping our guys about, guard him. So it was funny. I think it was Charles O'Bannon said, Coach, he goes, those are crazy shots. I'm guarding him, and then the players broke for the timeout. It was Lorenzo Romar, Mark Gottfried, and myself who were the assistants. And Lorenzo said to Coach, Coach, he's not lying. Those are crazy shots. And Lorenzo played the NBA. So, he had even more credibility.
Right.
And played against the best, played under Don Nelson, played for the Warriors and other teams. And he had scored, I think, in an athletes in action game exhibition against Michigan, the Fab, 4, I think, or the Fab 5. I think Lorenzo dropped 45 or 50 on the Fab 5 back in the day. So he had credibility. Yes. When he was like, Coach, no, those are crazy shots. We are guarding him. That's as good as you can guard, period. Now we can try and maybe cut down his catch, try and, play keep away or do box and one or something. But in terms of our man coverages, that's as good as it gets. He just making shots, So I'd say Jason Kidd, Ray Allen, man, as a broadcaster, there's players I just really admired, like Jalen Brunson, at Villanova in their run. I covered his teams and his leadership. I think, he's as intelligent and crafty. What's interesting is he's not a traditional, great athlete.
Right.
But he's a great athlete in terms of understanding angles, efficiency of movement, purposeful use of the bounce, his vision, and kind of making up for his lack of great athleticism.
Right.
And so, I'd say Jalen Brunson, of late comes to mind. Really, Villanova's teams I've had great admiration for. Obviously, I love Purdue. Wisconsin under Bo Ryan.
Yeah.
That run I had a chance to cover during those 77 years from 2003 to 2010. Brent Musburger and I and Aaron Andrews, our sideline reporter. And also I worked with Dave O'Brien, had a good run with him, but we covered the Big Ten for those 7 years. And, Michigan State, we know Tom Izzo, I see him as a great CEO.
Yeah.
Krzyzewski is great CEO. Roy Williams are great CEOs. But Bo Ryan had the CEO skills, but his results in terms of the consistency, and it's interesting, Matt had as much success against Bo Ryan as anybody during that run, which speaks to Matt's coaching ability. But I'd say, Bo Ryan, during those 7 years, I may have admired what he did with that program. Then, of course, he had the Final Fours later.
Yep.
And I know Coach Keady sometimes get mad at me because he thought I was giving too much love to Bo Ryan. But he's like, he's not that good. I was like, Coach, he's pretty good. I was like, I'm telling you, I said, I know I've got the bias, prejudice perspective. I love Purdue, but I also got to keep it real as an analyst. That's what I'm getting paid to do. And I'll give you all the love, when it's deserved. I said, but, if Purdue's not playing well, I can't crush my credibility by giving them so much hype and so much love when the reality is really Bo Ryan during that period of time, I thought got as much out of his personnel. When we talk about maximizing talent. Going back earlier, you asked other guys. I said Pete Newell, coach that maximizes personnel or talent. Pete Carrill at Princeton. I think Coach Keady, Bo Ryan. There was a guy way back, Charlie Spoonhauer, who I felt was one of those coaches as well. And there are others. I think Dick and Tony Bennett both are in that category what Tony Bennett's done of late at Virginia is also ridiculous, and winning ACC championships, regular season, postseason. He makes it look like it's easy to win 30 games. I mean, every year it seems like he's between 27 and 30 wins, if not more, and the national championship. And probably could have had a second. They had some heartbreakers too. Big lead against Syracuse in the NCAA tournament. I think that team could have won a championship. And Virginia imposes their preferred tempo as well as any team in the country. And that's a key to winning. And whether it's imposing a fast tempo, Virginia's happens to be more deliberate and precise. And Villanova's done that. They're always playing at as slow a tempo, yet it's so efficient that it doesn't seem like they're playing slow. But if you look at the numbers, they're 338 or 339 in Division I basketball, and the tempo metrics or analytics. And that's really slow. Yeah. But what it is they're just working for a good shot along the way, hoping to get fouled. They're the type of team that never swings at bad pitches. So they're not beating themselves. That means not taking bad shots. They very rarely get penalized, like a great football team that doesn't get penalties. They don't reach, they don't lunge, they don't gamble. So teams, rarely get to the double bonus against them. And they're rarely in a situation where they've got a lot of foul trouble because they're so disciplined with their defense. We always think about discipline and shot selection, but there's also discipline in the defense, right? Moving the feet, not lunging, not gambling, be in position, play defense before your man gets the ball, because then you're less foul prone, right? Yeah. And if your man doesn't get the ball, you don't have to worry about a foul to begin with. So, and Villanova does that, I think, as well as anybody in the country. And again, once you start talking about coaches and teams and programs, there are a lot of great programs in this NCAA tournament. We saw some really impressive runs by teams like Oregon State that was unexpected. UCLA, my old school, had a great run to the Final Four, knocking out Michigan State in a game they were trailing by 11. So, but anyway, I digress. Let's get back to your questions. Sorry.
Oh no, that was perfect. I mean, no, that was really, really. I mean, that was what I was asking for. For all the players you named, all the players those are icons. So, like I always say, for you, what you've seen, I'm able to come in and coaching so early, it allowed you to start seeing the game through a different lens. And for you
That's true.
Had this experience the last, 40 years.
Yep.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and Glenn Robinson's in that mix too. Big dog.
Big dog.
We left. So I went to UCLA. I think the next year Glenn came in, or maybe it had been that season. Conzo, right, in that mix too. Because they overlapped a couple of years with Waddell and Painter and Link Darner and some of the other Boilermakers of that era. But Glenn Robinson's run, before the back injury that he had against Duke, I think he got the night before the Duke game, he got a back injury through some infamous, wrestling match or something up in their hotel room. 18 to 22-year-olds, right? Just you never know. They keep you on your toes. But Glenn Robinson, I remember I was at UCLA and I'd go to a sports bar to watch the Purdue games on satellite. And it was solely to see Glenn perform. He was that entertaining. And obviously Mackey was rocking during those years. But I remember him going on the road at Wisconsin. I think they pulled off a really tough game. Michael Finley might have been at Wisconsin. Stu Jackson might have been the coach. Maybe it was Stan Van Gundy, but anyway, big dog, and that to me, the golden era. I know this year the Big Ten had the deepest conference in the country in terms of 9 bids to the NCAA tournament, but I still think the greatest years were like late 80s through, let's say, maybe late 90s, and definitely through the mid 90s. When Michigan wins the championship with Glenn Rice and Ramil Robinson and Loy Vaught, Illinois had that great team with, Bardo and Liberty and company. I think Hamilton was on that team too. But those, Tom Davis has had some Iowa teams that were off the hinges. And I think those were the golden years. Bill Foster was at Northwestern, Coach Keady at Purdue, Tom Davis at Iowa, Clem Haskins at Minnesota, Bobby Knight at Indiana, Judd Heathcote at Michigan State, Tom Davis at Iowa. I think I mentioned him. Oh, Bill Frieder was at Michigan. Later, Steve Fisher took over. But I mean, as an apprentice, as an aspiring coach, being on staff, preparing to play those teams, and then watching the chess match between the head coaches, between the staffs, and seeing the talent that was on the floor. I mean, it was crazy. And then it continued through the early 90s and with Glenn and Conzo's run at Purdue and the three-peat. I think they won 3 Big Ten championships in a row. And that's one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about Coach Keady being deserving of Naismith Hall of Fame induction is, you know, he didn't accumulate a lot of wins against, you know, poor competition.
Right.
He was picking up those Big Ten wins during the golden years of the conference. He was going against Lute Olson when Lute Olson was at Iowa before Tom Davis took over at Iowa. I mean, he was facing Hall of Fame coaches and handing it to him. I mean, let's face it, Coach Keady was dominating during those years. And so I'm like, wait, how are all those guys in the Hall of Fame, but not Coach Keady, right? Coach Katie's got the only winning record against Bobby Knight in terms of other Big Ten coaches that had, you know, enough games to qualify for that category.
Right.
So when you look at what he did at every step, high school basketball, he dominated, JC basketball, he dominated, you know, West Kentucky dominated, Purdue, he dominated, then assistant with the Raptors and his contributions to the NBA, USA basketball and the gold medals and the contributions to USA basketball, his time with me for 5 years at St. John's, giving back to the game and kids, his time as an analyst in the Big Ten Network. It's like, are you kidding me? This guy's not in the Hall of Fame, and nothing against other people that are. Yeah. But, you know, if you look at the numbers, because some people say, well, he didn't go to the Final Four, but there's other guys that are in, deserve it of being in. John Chaney's one. He deserves to be in, no doubt. But John Chaney is really the Black Coach Keady. You know, he was a Division II coach. He was a high school coach. He dominated those levels, won a national championship Division II at Chaney State. And then he had a dominant run at Temple. And he was an ambassador and a statesman for the game. And that's why we love him, his authenticity, his passion, coaching life and preparing young people for life. And that's why his players have such reverence for him, is they know that his love was authentic and real. And that's why John Chaney's in. And it's the same thing with Coach Keady. I'm like, okay, I know Coach didn't play or coach in the East Coast. He's a Midwest guy, but he did coach as an assistant at St. John's, you know, so he needs to be in the Hall of Fame while he's still with us. The other thing I don't understand is why people wait and then, you know, coaching giant passes away and then they have a tribute. They induct him into the Hall of Fame. Why not, you know, allow that coach who earned an induction in the Hall of Fame be able to celebrate it with his family, his extended family, and to really, you know, be able to get his fair due, you know, his deserved due as a legendary coach. And but going back to those years in the Big Ten, I think that's one of the strongest elements to building the argument for Coach Keady being in the Hall of Fame. Look at this, you know, 6 Big Ten championships, with 7 Big Ten Coach of the Year, 6 National Coach of the Year awards, 6. I mean, some guys get 1 National Coach of the Year award in their entire career. This guy got 6. I mean, yeah, really is.
Yeah, he's not in that. That's so. Yeah, we definitely. No, I'm glad. I didn't know that. I didn't even know he wasn't in the Hall of Fame. I would have just easily thought he was in. I didn't have
right.
no idea. So no, that's definitely because I think that should be a big push, honestly. So I definitely want that narrative to be
hashtag it. Yeah. Induct Coach Keady.
Yeah, because he should, like you said, especially while he's with us, while he's kicking healthy, especially
exactly.
I mean, you see Coach Keady on like his Facebook fan page, he's having fun. So it's like he's having a good time. So it's like it definitely, like you said, well deserving. Because everything I've learned from you today, learning about Coach Keady, it's still lasting at Purdue now. I mean, Coach Payne definitely is like I like how you call it the CEO. Coach Payne is running his ship. It's how Coach Payne wants it. But Coach Payne is a branch off of that tree. You know what I mean? So
definitely.
It's one of those things where I don't see why he's not in. I couldn't fathom the reason. But no,
yeah.
Coach. Coach, and just one last thing about
Sure.
this weekend is the Bill Hensley Memorial Running Slam. I just wanted to mention that because I know we both have a connection there with the Hensley family. And just kind of just through mentorship, I know you had some connection with Bill. I had some connection with Bill, then JR and Todd, the sons. So this is kind of when I heard that, just about Todd when he used to go to your camps and whatnot, it just kind of really brought things full circle to me and really kind of showed me how important mentorship is, because you never know, you could mentor one person or have influence on one person, and then years later you have influence on another person, and then those people meet up. So that was one of those moments for me, realizing that. But I appreciate everything you've done with basketball. I mean, everything that you've been through with basketball, from John Wooden to Coach Keady to Coach Knight, to obviously your own career, to commentating, the things you've seen, the players you've watched. I mean, we didn't even touch on the players you touched. I mean, Matt Barnes, I mean, different guys that's come through your system. So it's one of those things where, I mean, even going to St. John's, and that's just beautiful, going to St. John's and bringing Coach Keady. I mean, having Coach Keady come along with you as an ambassador program, or just I can't think of just the
yeah, he was like, we called him our basketball Buddha, our Mr. Miyagi, and our Oracle, and he was someone that could help coach the coaches, and for me, every game sitting on the bench, he was to my left, and that was my first boss, started 33 years ago. And so there's a comfort level of having, the equivalent of your father or grandfather of basketball. And then on my right was the equivalent of my firstborn. Rico Hines was my first recruit at UCLA. We signed him out of St. John's Prospect Hall, and I think it was Frederick, Maryland, if I'm not mistaken. And so Rico was my first recruit, and he was my first hire after Coach Keady, because Coach Keady was like special assistant, and Rico was my first sign. So I had, firstborn and my first boss, and, being flanked by them, because I was returning after being away from coaching. And even though had the best seat in the house as a broadcaster, it's like anything else. You're sharpening the axe as you go. Yep. And we were fortunate that first year we kind of captured lightning in a bottle, and we ended up making the NCAA tournament. I think, beating a lot of top 25 teams and top 10 teams. And it was a kind of a magical year, because we inherited a group of seniors from Norm Roberts, but they hadn't, reached their full potential yet. Right. And so we kind of saw our job was to take the baton from Coach Roberts and, finish the job, cross the finish line, and get this group of seniors to an NCAA tournament, because they hadn't had a winning record in Big East play yet. And it came faster than we thought, but then we lost all 12 of those seniors, and we had to start fresh. It was almost like an expansion program, unprecedented in Division I basketball at that level. At least in my experience, I've never seen a situation where in year two, you don't have a single player with a minute of Division I basketball. We had one, and that was Malik Stith, who transferred at semester. But every other, and it was a good group, Maurice Harkless and D'Angelo Harris and Phil Green and Dominic Pointer and Amir Garrett, who's now pitching with the Cincinnati Reds, Jakar's with the Indiana Pacers, and Mo Harkless is with Sacramento Kings. So our first recruiting class was third in the country behind Duke and Kentucky. Right. And but we didn't have a single minute Division I experience returning, except for Malik Stith, who transferred. Right. And so we, had to start over. And that second year is the year I had cancer. So I missed a full year with cancer recovering at home. Then we came back, get 17 wins, go 8-10 in the old Big East. This is when Notre Dame, Pittsburgh, UConn, Syracuse, West Virginia. It wasn't the realigned Big East that we have now. And then our fourth year, we won 20 games. And then when those guys were seniors, we won 21 games and went back to the NCAA tournament. But we had a new president, and Father Harrington, who hired me, had been at St. John's for like 25 years. He gets pushed out. New president comes in, and he's enamored, understandably, with Chris Mullin, who's coaching giant. I grew up watching Chris Mullin as a Golden State Warriors fan, Hall of Fame player. Right. So they end up making the change, hoping that could lead to Final Fours or national titles. And now Mike Anderson's there trying to get it going. They made a little bit of progress this past year. But, seniors are so important, and experience, right? And it's not just seniors. It has to be seniors that can play.
Right.
Coach Wooden used to say the worst thing you can have is experienced players that can't play. He goes, I'd rather have, that's what Coach Wood said. He goes, I'd rather have young players that can play. In other words, young players with talent and gifts is better than older players that don't have talent or gifts. And that's back to a little bit of Coach Wooden's common sense that, yes, the X's and O's are important, but it's the Jimmies and the Joes. They're actually going up and down the floor and helping you get stops, and then working offensively to get good shots and hustling in between, which is, transition offense and transition defense. Get your special situations, obviously, and late clock situations and your out of bounds plays, and, sprinkle in some changing defenses, but pretty much, right, it's trying to get a good shot on offense, and that helps set your defense so you can get back and not let them get good shots when you play defense. And then hustle in between, try and get a fast break at that end and take their fast breaks away at the other end. And then again, get organized for some out of bounds plays. And that's really, when you simplify things, what basketball comes down to. We sometimes make it sound like it's rocket science. It's challenging to be proficient and be efficient and be consistent in playing the game the right way. But the objectives are not that complicated in terms of what we're trying to do. Sometimes as coaches, we mess it up. Sometimes players, because of their inexperience and not having the perspective, screw it up. And sometimes both happens. Players and coaches are screwing it up. That's when really you're going to have a tough season. that's the type of season that costs you your job.
100%. That's funny.
Do you have any of those questions from your viewers that they sent in?
I asked two of them.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
I asked two of them, the best player you've seen, the best performance.
Perfect.
The Purdue game. But yeah, I think all of that is good, Coach.
Good.
I appreciate the time, Coach. I appreciate everything you've given to basketball. Even outside of coaching, I know you used to run camps and stuff like that. So everything you've given to basketball, everything, like you said, you fought to be where you are. Even through health situations and health issues. I'm a big fan. I've been a big fan. I appreciate you joining us today. I know a lot of Purdue fans, a lot of just basketball fans can learn a lot. Just not just about Purdue from this episode, but just about basketball and just the law of the land. Because giving it as real as you just gave it, there's no other way you could do but learn from this episode. So, Coach, I appreciate it.
Ray, thank you for starters for those kind words, or I guess in closing, I want to thank you for those kind words. And I enjoy, the banter conversation with you. You've got a gift in terms of your natural authenticity. We talked about that at other points today. And authenticity, being genuine, is a gift. And you talked about, listening being a gift. But authenticity and being genuine and being other directed, being interested, which I think is something else that's really important. It's the equivalent of being curious, being interested, and never losing that kind of childlike curiosity, as you go through life. And you're exhibiting that. So I really enjoy your natural, genuine way. And then also back to that, event coming up, the Hensley family is really extended family for me. And JR went to IU, but the majority, of the family, they're Boilermakers and grew up Purdue fans. JR kind of broke from the tribe by going to IU. And of course, Todd would have come to Purdue, but he played basketball, had opportunities. I think, was it Florida International?
Yeah,
I think he played in Florida somewhere, if I'm not mistaken. But they're all basketball. As JR's success as an agent in basketball, and Todd with the camps, with the training, and his love of the game, is just a basketball Jones. He loves it. And the father was the same way, right? Successful in business as a banker. And the father was a game changer for me because he met me, I think, at a Purdue coaches clinic. And one of the situations we were talking about where Coach Keady would give his assistants latitude or freedom to get on the floor and teach. And that's how I met Coach Herrick, was in Colorado Springs when I was leading the defensive drills, footwork, stance, and all the things, dig hand, fire feet, taking charges, diving on the floor. And Coach Herrick was there. Tracy Murray and Trevor Wilson, if I'm not mistaken, were at the trials. And that led to meeting Coach Keady and played a part when you add the John Wooden Purdue piece. And it's why I ended up at UCLA for 12 years. But I met Bill Hensley at the defensive clinic. He comes up after we exchanged numbers. He ends up flying me, up to his clinic and working with his AAU team. And and that led to meeting Coach Sims. We were talking earlier about Ray Sims, who was coaching there at the time, and met JR and Todd. And then, of course, the father passed way too young, as you know. Rest in peace, Bill Hensley. But continued, to stay in touch and have been friends and family with Bill's wife and JR and Todd. So I'm glad that Bill Hensley's legacy is carrying on, through basketball. It's so appropriate. But he actually co-signed on a banknote for maybe $2,500 or $5,000 because I didn't have any dough or credit to speak of at my age. And that allowed me to go to UCLA. So, he was adamant, because I knew UCLA starting out as a volunteer assistant, entry-level assistant, and the cost of living in LA was dramatically more than the cost of living in Lafayette, West Lafayette. But Bill's like, look, you got an opportunity to go, work at UCLA. You can't turn that down. And I said, well, I just can't afford it, And he said, okay. He goes, we'll take care of that. I think it was Wabash Union or, Wabash Bank that I came up, signed the papers on. And then I was able, the first year I became a paid assistant, I was able to pay that off. But my run at UCLA never happens without Bill Hensley co-signing on that banknote. It's basically, back then they called it banknotes. I guess it's equivalent of a loan, because my parents were educators. They raised 6 kids. They didn't have the dough to come out of pocket for me either, So, and also I was fortunate out of Boston, Coach Keady, that understood that, hey, you got an opportunity to go back west. We'll bring you back later when there's some movement on the staff. But then by the time the movement happened, I was already a head coach at UCLA. Wow. And so Bill really plays a pivotal role in my complete career journey or trajectory or path. And so forever indebted to that family. And that's, why I would tell my players, you just never know where a guardian angel, where a gift will reveal, so do the right thing, treat people with respect, add value, and, all the important, have, be interested, have compassion, and we learn those as we go. We sharpen those sensibilities right through life experience. So it's natural, as an 18-year-old or 21-year-old to not possess all those qualities, but you can start to nudge young people towards those. Again, going back to sport providing this ideal platform to instill these really important traits, characteristics, qualities that will carry you past, your playing career. Exactly. And allow you to be successful and achieve. And so I would tell our players, you never know who's watching, and you want to do it the right thing, because on principle, that's what you should do. But there are these kind of practical, unexpected gifts that reveal and also help, because you're doing the right thing. And not always, it doesn't always work out. It may not be immediate, but long haul, it works out, like the effort you're putting in to this podcast, right? And so it's just going to continue to grow and be successful because you're doing the right things. You're building a foundation like you do in a good basketball program, and you have to do that right in your life. We all do, and stay true to that, sustain it. Easier said than done, but that's the idea.
Yeah, 100%. And now, that for what, it's beautiful. What Bill was able to do for you, Like you said, maybe you don't end up at UCLA without that happening. I don't know if I end up at high major AAU basketball or high level basketball, period, if I don't get the opportunity from Bill to bring me to speed. I think I'm in sixth grade or something, and I'm playing with my community team on my side of town, one of the better players. Bill gives me the opportunity to come out there with them and those guys before he passed. That I'm immersed in the family. Bill passes, Todd takes care of me. I talked to Todd yesterday. So it's one of the things where it's wild to see just how certain families and certain people are just good people, and they can just take care of you, and their legacy just will impact you forever. Because I didn't know Bill for that long, and even right before he passed, I always still say I'm a branch off of his tree, and then to eventually find out that you're also a branch off the tree. I mean, it's just
no doubt.
It's just you're always just one person from knowing everybody. And so,
the 6 degrees of separation too.
Yep.
There's a quote that Coach Wooden, and he's got so many great quotes, and often Coach Wooden was paraphrasing or borrowing, like we talked about, borrowing recipes to add to your cookbook. But one of many great quotes that Wooden would use, it was initially Winston Churchill, but a life without giving is a life not worth living. A life without giving is a life not worth living. And so it's that, again, back to generosity of spirit and actions and deeds. And Bill, right, demonstrated that. And now his children, right, and Cindy, his wife, they're carrying that forward in terms of the spirit of a generosity and caring and community and family. And another Wooden, so many great ones, right? 6 Degrees of Purdue, can never have enough John Wooden, 3-time All-American with the Boilermakers. But he used to say the greatest thing we can do for those we love is to not do for them what they're capable of doing for themselves. The greatest thing we can do for those we love is to not do for them what they're capable of doing for themselves. And that's tied into self-reliance. And it might have been a version, again, paraphrasing from Lincoln, because Lincoln was Wooden's favorite American. Mother Teresa was, Lincoln was Coach Wooden's favorite American. Mother Teresa was his favorite person, because a life dedicated to service and helping those in need, poverty, the poor throughout the world. And his favorite comedian was Bob Newhart, because he liked his clever humor. And but he also had a quote that the greatest thing we can do, or the greatest gift a parent can give their children, is to love their spouse. So in other words, the model of a husband loving his wife is the most profound or powerful gift that you can give the children. And that means listening and respect and deference and all those elements. And the same, the greatest gift a mother can give her children is loving and respecting her husband, their parents, right? The children's parents. And so that's another really good one in terms of back to, modeling and emulating the right virtues and values and setting that good example, because young people are so impressionable. And the same goes with coaching, that, he always felt the best leaders, the best coaches, the best teachers, and the best parents are setting the right examples, who they are. It's going to influence and shape their children, their players, their pupils, their workforce that they're managing if they're a leader. And so that, always remembering just setting the right example. And Bill and Cindy and now Todd and JR are, examples of people that are blazing the right trail for others to follow and setting a really good example. But I could go all day on Coach Wooden and his quotes. So
those are great quotes. And just like JR, like I said, I've known JR and Todd since I was a child. I came into a situation like you said, with my podcast. There's a network. They sent me a contract. I know JR since I was a child. Text JR the contract. JR texts right back with his red line, is ask for this, say this, that. And I hadn't talked to JR before this in, I think, 2 years. So it's one of those things where, Bill did a great job. And from JR, the support that, even from California, that he gives, it's been huge. So
yeah, he's done that he's helped me with the contracts too.
Cool.
He's obviously expert. He's sharp, and those things we talked about earlier, the traits of attention to detail, and yet also thinking creatively, and because you have to keep evolving and keep growing. And he's interested enough to where you're seeing that. You see that with Todd on the enterprise side, the business side, and the skill development side, because you have to keep growing. The old school virtues and values, the timeless, what I call meat, potatoes, or ABCs, don't change, but sometimes how we present them in a more fresh and original way or creative way will allow us to be more successful at passing it on, right? Because that's that thing, Coach Wooden, again, that while he was taking psychology classes, he knew what he wanted to instill, the important traits, cooperation and initiative and resourcefulness and ingenuity and all these important traits. But, they're just words if you can't kind of show it, demonstrate it, bring it to life in a three-dimensional way, so that younger people, the students, the pupils, can grasp it and then be able to pass it on to the next generation of why these things are so important, but you see that with JR and with Todd in terms of their creativity, right? And you're doing it with your show, right? Each show informs the next. Yeah. Each experience is something you build off of. You'll go back and watch and say, hey, this went well. I could, maybe I could have improved on that. I give you an A+ on your ability to conversate. I watched the one with you and Coach Painter a couple of nights ago, just in preparation for this, because I want to have a feel of the vibe and the energy and how you, kind of how you conduct business, as we talked about, being professional, and it's a very professional manner. And you could tell you were, the right things have been instilled along the way. And we're seeing that in a three-dimensional way with this show.
No, I appreciate it. That's big time. That's especially from for someone that's learned from the greatest to give me those type of words, I can't take it with nothing but gratitude. I appreciate that. That is it means a lot for me for you to say that. It means a lot for me for you to join the podcast and be so willing to join the podcast. I can't say I appreciate it enough. And I know everybody out there listening, definitely appreciate it. I got nothing but great feedback when I announced that you were going to be on the podcast. So I know everybody's excited to hear
nice.
That. So Coach, again, thank you to everybody out there. Again, we have our basketball camp we have a basketball camp in Fort Wayne, June 7th through 10th at Sports One. We're having 30 Fort Wayne Community School kids come for free if they cannot afford it. But then we're going to West Lafayette, June 21st to June 24th at Faith East Community Center and having another basketball camp there. If you need more details, RaphealDavisBasketball.com. RaphealDavisBasketball.com. Another big shout out to the Bob Roman Automotive Group, and thanks for sponsoring the episode. To all the boilers out there, boiler up. Have a great week, great weekend, and enjoy the episode. Thank you.